York branch of Solidarity sociology teacher. We have a copy of his book. Remember, there's the talk tomorrow. But we've got copies of the book if you guys want it. Without further ado, you may go ahead and talk. And this is now going to be eternal because it's on video.
Yes, it'll never go away. All right, well, I want to start by thanking Jason and the other comrades in the Mid-Tennessee branch of Solidarity for inviting me here. And folks asked me to talk about some stuff. I've given a couple of talks on a similar topic, which is why the rise of the right, in particular, why the rise of the Tea Party. Because in some ways, the rise of this sort of new right in the last 3-4 years is in some ways paradoxical. Back in 2007, 2008, in the height of the financial crisis, the height of the global capitalist economic meltdown, governments all over the world very briefly seem to be abandoning free market neoliberal orthodoxy. They're pumping billions into the economy to save banks, save major industries, etc. And even among large segments of the population, people were repulsed by the results of neoliberalism. There was the Newsweek, the mainstream U.S. publication, on their cover in February 2009 said, "We're all socialists," by which they meant, of course, people who believed in government regulation, Keynesian government regulation, not the sort of socialism we talk about. A poll in April of 2009 found that only 53% of people still supported free market capitalism, and while a full 20% said they wanted socialism, more government regulation. But by the fall of 2009, the major political force that was dominating politics, particularly in the United States, and you see this in other parts of the industrial capitalist world as well, was this extremely militantly free market, racist, xenophobic, homophobic, sexist, and explicitly anti-union populist right, which in the US took the form of the Tea Party. It was them who was dominating the streets, mobilizing tens of thousands of people against Obama's health care proposal, which most of us on the left knew was basically a huge subsidy of private insurance companies, but which they were denouncing as socialism. The left, the labor movement, traditional movements of people of color, women, queer folks, etc., were completely marginalized, while the new right basically swept the 2010 congressional elections. The Tea Party had its greatest impact in Republican primaries and in congressional swing districts that the Democrats had taken by relatively small margins in 2008. The Republicans, by 2011, the beginning of the next congressional session, including a substantial minority of very hardcore Tea Party zealots, committed to austerity and deregulation, won a majority in the House, and deprived the Democrats of their veto-proof supermajority in the Senate. Now, in the last year or so, there's been some decline of the Tea Party, but they got their man as vice president, Paul Ryan, big Ayn Rand fan, as the vice presidential candidate. And in fact, much of what we can see as the incredibly self-destructive behavior of Mitt Romney in the last few months has basically been an attempt to try to woo the right-wing base of the party. Now, liberals and leftists in the US have put forward a number of explanations for why we saw the rise of this new right. One of them, which was put forward, I think, by a good portion of the liberal and sort of, social democratic analysts in the US was that, in fact, the 2010 election, the rise of the Tea Party, demonstrated what was the fundamental conservatism of the US population. The election of Obama was really a blip, an anomaly. And his policies were just too radical for most Americans, pushing them back into the arms of the far right. Well, this argument actually has very little empirical basis. If you look at the only real source we have on who votes for whom, the exit polls, and you compare the exit polls for 2008 and 2010, what you find is there isn't a big shift to the right in US public opinion. The seismic shift in representation in the House of Representatives was the result of very, very small shifts in the participation of key groups of voters in that election. Essentially, what we saw was about 3% of all eligible voters shifted from the Democrats to the Republicans. Many people stayed home. In 2008, the Democrats had won 54.2% of the popular vote, with 62% of the electorate voting, which was the highest it had been sometime since the 60s. In 2010, the Republicans score about 54% of the vote, but only 40% of eligible voters are voting. So what you're seeing is a very small shift in people who had previously maybe voted for Bush, etc., who voted for Obama in 2008, shifting, but more importantly, key people, key groups in the electorate didn't come out. In particular, 3 key groups didn't come out in 2010, stayed home. The groups that, in fact, had given Obama and the Democrats their majority in 2008. First, people of color. In 2008, people of color made up over 26% of the electorate. In 2010, it's down to 22%, a drop of almost 1/5. We see an even bigger drop among young voters. Voters under the age of 45 made up over almost half of all voters in 2008, but were about 1/3 of voters in 2010. And union households, the percentage of union households voting, dropped from 21 to 17%. In other words, the key groups that had given the Democrats a victory in the White House in 2008 and majorities both the House and Senate stayed home. Stayed home. Not that there was this huge shift that people discovered that they'd been sold, some secret socialist and some far leftist that they were disgusted with, but more that the people who had voted for Obama in the hope of some sort of progressive alternative stayed home in 2010 because they were basically very disappointed. There's all sorts of additional data in terms of public opinion polling, which shows that very consistently most Americans embrace what we would broadly call progressive politics. Since 1984, majorities of people in the US who've been polled by Gallup are absolutely in favor of that wealth and income should be more evenly distributed in the United States. They believe that government should tax the wealthy more heavily. About 2/3 of those earning less than $30,000 annually, and slightly over half of those earning between $30,000 and $75,000 want higher taxes on the rich. So there's no evidence of this huge shift to the right in public opinion. The second argument that's put forward more by elements of what we would identify as a socialist or radical or anti-capitalist left is that basically the Tea Party was a creation of the capitalist class. Capitalists came in and they decided they didn't like what Obama was doing and they were going to push the Tea Party forward. And usually when people make this argument, they point to folks like the Koch brothers in Wisconsin who have been financing the Republicans' assault on collective bargaining in Wisconsin, Ohio, a number of other states. Now, it's absolutely clear, and I'll present lots of evidence, that broad sections of the capitalist class in the United States support a resurgent and militant neoliberal policy. They want balance, but they want budgets, balance on the backs of working and poor people, they want austerity, and they want new attacks on public sector unions. They all agree on that. And there's ample evidence that key segments of the capitalist media, in particular Fox News, played a very big role in creating and mobilizing the Tea Party. There's very little evidence that capitalists lead, finance, or actually direct the growing populist right. In 2010, if you look at corporate contributions from wealthy individuals, corporate political action committees, etc., in fact, they gave slightly more money to the Democrats in 2010 than they gave to the Republicans. They were covering all their bets. until very, very recently, and probably it will happen now that Romney's stumbling, as late as, April of 2012, Obama had outraised in terms of campaign finances, all of the Republican candidates put together. It has only been in the last month or so that Romney began to raise money from traditional Republican corporate donors. The Democrats responded by creating their own super PACs, by going after big corporate donors who give to the Democrats. With Romney stumbling, I think we will see in the next 6 weeks more and more capitalist funding going to Obama and the Democrats. But even more importantly, on certain practical political issues, the capitalist class in the United States politically has a very ambivalent relationship with the Tea Party and the far right. On the one hand, where their interests coincide, tax cuts on the wealthy, cuts to social services, further deregulation, capital is willing to back the Tea Party, support its mobilizations, encourage its folks to push as far as they can. However, on two key issues, capitalists in the United States have been very, very upset with the Tea Party. One is immigration, and the other is the refusal of the Congress their willingness actually to risk a possible federal credit default by not raising the debt ceiling. And if you look, and the evidence for this is if looking at what are the two most important political organizations of the capitalist class in the United States. One is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents a very broad section of the capitalist class, from mom and pop, 40, 50 employee businesses, all the way up to some of the transnationals. The other important organization is the Business Roundtable, which has 200-300 members, but it's all the the CEOs of all the transnationals. These are the two organizations that over the last 40 years or so have been crucial in forming capitalist political opinion and pushing forward the agenda that we call neoliberalism. Now, the Chamber of Commerce initially was very happy with Obama's initial budget proposal. They were very willing to work with Obama and the new House majority to basically push their priorities, which included cuts to social services, particularly Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. But the Chamber of Commerce did not want to see a credit default. They understood that a credit default could undermine U.S. even small businesses, small and medium businesses operating within the U.S., because it could lead to a paralysis of the financial system. On immigration, the Chamber of Commerce has the complete opposite politics of the Tea Party. The Tea Party are the people who are pushing through these state initiatives that are incredibly draconian, incredibly repressive against undocumented immigrants. The most important that most of us know about is the Senate Bill 1070 in Arizona, which basically gives the local police and the state police the authority to essentially arrest and begin the deportation process. There were several key groups that brought the court case that went to the Supreme Court challenging SB 1070. The first was the American Civil Liberties Union. The second was the League of United Latin American Citizens, the main middle-class lobbying group for Latinos in the U.S. And the third group that financed and supported that was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has joined immigrant rights groups in denouncing not only SB 1070, but denouncing the Obama administration's silent raids, where federal ICE officials, Immigration Control and Enforcement officials, inspect employers' hiring records and force the employers to fire undocumented workers. The people in the Chamber of Commerce, these businesses, many of them small and medium businesses in very labor-intensive industries that rely heavily on the cheap and flexible labor of undocumented workers do not want mass deportations. They want borders that are neither completely open, which would allow immigrants to come in with full political rights and thus the right to organize, but at the same time, they don't want a closed border. They need a layer of cheap, vulnerable, and flexible workers. The Business Roundtable was also very clear that it did not agree with the Tea Party on these two key elements of policy. The Business Roundtable on immigration supports the McCain proposals that came out 6-7 years ago. They want a guest worker program. They want partial amnesty. That's their program for immigration, not mass deportations, not allowing local police to hassle immigrants, etc. They want a rational, repressive immigration policy. On the question of the debt ceiling, they were even clearer. They were basically scared shitless that if the U.S. defaulted, that this would create real problems for the international credit of U.S. transnationals. Their ability to finance production chains, finance their factories and offices and stores in other countries would be threatened if the federal government did not raise the debt ceiling and pushed very, very hard, particularly on the Republicans in Congress, to raise the debt ceiling. Okay? In other words, there's no clear evidence that the Tea Party and this far right is simply the creation of the capitalist class. The capitalist class is perfectly willing to use it where its interests coincide. Deregulation, union busting, repeal of the remnants of affirmative action, civil rights legislation, etc. But they are not going to back them on where their issues do not, where their politics do not coincide, particularly on immigration and the question of the debt ceiling. So, where does the Tea Party come from? And I would argue that the Tea Party basically represents a radicalization of segments of the professional and managerial middle class. That it's basically a radicalization of predominantly white, predominantly suburban, middle-class professionals, managers, and some small business owners. And they've gained the support of a significant minority of native-born, predominantly male, white workers, particularly non-union workers. So what we're seeing is these folks are looking for a radical alternative to the crisis. They want a real resolution of the crisis. But their resolution is one that will be ultra-free market, ultra-neoliberal, and that will put the burden for solving the crisis on the backs of workers, the remnants of organized labor in the United States, women, queer folks, people of color, and in particular, immigrants. Now, clearly the growth of this new middle-class far right has emboldened what is in this country still a fairly small and marginal fascist right. The Klan, the Christian white militias, etc. And while there are certain ideological similarities between this new right and classical fascism, particularly their appeal to a right-wing populism that sees as its subject small business people, managers, and professionals standing against both the forces of big capital and finance and the forces of the organized working class, the Tea Party essentially mobilizes elements of the middle class as passive voters, not as armed paramilitaries attacking unions, people of color, and immigrants. Paul Street, who wrote two really excellent books about Obama, one he published right before Obama got elected, and one he published about a year into the Obama administration. Street is probably the best person doing research on why Obama is probably the most conservative president in the last 30 years. He and Anthony DiMaggio just put out a book on the Tea Party, and they present a very convincing case that the Tea Party is a thoroughly top-down, primarily electoral, and media-fueled phenomena that has none of the characteristics, membership organizations, meetings, etc., of a social movement, either of the left or of classical far-right pop social movements. Ultimately, the rise of this middle-class far-right in the US, and we see similar phenomena in the rest of the capitalist world, is basically a product of the dual crisis of what in this country is called liberalism, and in the rest of the world we'd call social democratic reformism, and the failure of reformism to address the economic crisis, and the failure of the labor and social movements to pose a real political and social alternative to these forces of reformism. On the one hand, it's very clear that Obama and the Democrats have failed to address the economic crisis. Even today, we're looking at an official unemployment rate of what, 8.4 or 8.5, which, if you include all the folks who are underemployed and the folks who've given up looking for work, we probably have a real underemployment rate of close to 20%. If anything, the Democrats and Obama, despite their embrace of sort of pseudo-left populist rhetoric in the last few weeks, basically continue to embrace neoliberal policies. Low corporate taxes, business deregulation, global free trade, and austerity. Their willingness to concede additional budget cuts, including, they've signaled clearly that after the election, they are willing to talk about changes to the last two entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, in order to, once again, shows their deep commitment to neoliberalism. On the other side, the labor and social movements, and in particular their official leaderships, whether we're talking about the AFL-CIO, Change to Win, MoveOn.org, the NAACP, etc., all of these organizations, the mainstream queer groups, etc., have failed to mobilize working people in support of their own agenda. Rather than organizing folks for an immediate end to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, rather than mobilizing people for single-payer health care or universal amnesty for the undocumented, for the defense and expansion of public education and public services, the official leaders of our movements have basically gone along with Obama and the pro-corporate agenda. Put another way, rather than giving a progressive and class direction to the growing anger over unemployment, falling living standards, etc., the forces of official reformism, of official reform, have actually helped create the political space for the growth of this new right wing. The Tea Party is filling the political vacuum that's left by the failures of official liberalism and of official reformism in the United States and globally. Unfortunately, many on the anti-capitalist left have contributed to this situation by basically arguing that the left, rather than organizing independently and if necessary against these forces, has to seek a strategic alliance with Obama, the Democrats, and the forces of official reform. Many of them believe that a coalition of the left, labor officials, the leaders of the social movements can somehow push the Democrats to the left, to force them to take up the more progressive demands in order to mobilize disaffected workers, people of color, young people, etc., to retake the House and retake the White House in 2012. Unfortunately, this is a complete delusion. It's utopian. The Democrats have never, in the last 40 years since the decline of mass social movements, and are not going to shift to the left to recapture their base. Instead, they're going to continue to do what they have done since 1988, 84 to be honest, which is to move to the right to attract middle-class voters and corporate donors. And we see this very clearly. Back where I live in New York State, we have a progressive Democrat in the State House, Andrew Cuomo. who has gone on an all, while on the one hand giving legalized gay marriage, has on the other hand gone on an all-out assault against social welfare, public education, and the public sector unions. At this point, the only real difference between Democrats and Republicans in the United States is that the Republicans want to smash what's left of the unions, particularly in the public sector. The Democrats are more than willing for the unions to maintain ostensible collective bargaining rights, and most importantly, have members and collect dues so that the unions can provide them with funding and, more importantly, a cadre of people to make phone calls and knock on doors, etc. during elections. Cuomo has been very clear. He loves unions, as long as the unions are willing to sit down and give every single concession on services, wages, and benefits that he asks for. We can see this, we saw this very clearly with the Democratic machine in Chicago just in the last few weeks. Now, historically, all attempts by the left in the US to build an alliance with Democratic Party centrists have actually led to the disorganization and decline of the movements and have actually facilitated a shift to the right. Time and time again, from the upsurge of industrial workers in the 1930s, through the civil rights and black power movements during the 60s and 70s, through the movements against the Vietnam War, the decision of leaders of powerful and potentially radical movements to pursue an alliance with the Democrats have actually derailed these struggles. Today, attempts to push the Democrats to the left, make them fight, etc., will not only be futile, but I think will actually strengthen this right-wing populism. Such calls, we can see, have become louder and louder in the last year or two. As the right has emerged, as they pushed forward, more and more people on the left saying we've got to re-elect Obama. We've got to pursue this strategic alliance. The problem is that when leftists and radicals actually endorse and campaign for Obama, I'm not talking about the folks we know who are going to hold their nose and go in and pull the lever for Obama. I'm not going to do that. But other folks are, if they want to. That's the least important thing. What's important, though, is when our folks, rather than challenging their union leaders to be more militant, rather than organizing for single payer, rather than organizing defense of immigrant workers, go out and campaign for Obama, it actually undermines our ability to try to rebuild progressive and radical social movements. First of all, time is a limited resource. When you spend your time ringing doorbells for Obama and the Democrats, you're not out organizing people to fight. But secondly, there's a logic to campaigning. I remember back in 1984 and 1988, lots of people on the left said, we can work for Jesse Jackson in his campaigns for president, and it's an opportunity for us to go talk to people about the issues that we think are important. War and peace, social services, unions, the rights of people of color, etc. But the reality was, when you go out and campaign for centrist or right-wing, right-centrist Democrats, your job is to get people out to vote on the lowest possible basis possible. You're not going to be going and knocking on doorbells and going, hi, I want you to vote for Barack Obama. I hate his health care program, we need single payer. I hate the drones, and I think we should get the hell out of the Middle East. I think we should have strong and militant unions, and his public education policy is a disaster. But you should vote for him. The people who are working with you and you're campaigning with are going to basically get you either pushed out or fired. And the people you're talking to are going, well, if you think this guy's policies suck, why do you want to vote for him? The logic of campaigning is for us, when radicals campaign for these people, which is what the strategic alliance means, then what we're doing is we are folding our tents. we are giving up our organizing, we're giving up our politics, and pushing the politics of these rightward moving Democrats. This leaves them, the Democrats, more free to compromise once more with the Republicans over cutting taxes for the rich, etc. And with our movements weakened and invisible, our alliance with the Democrats will allow the new right, this populist right, to remain the only voice of militant and radical opposition to the failed policies of the Democrats. Now, we also have to be clear that growing disillusionment with the Democrats, neoliberalism, etc., is not necessarily going to spontaneously lead to a left-wing radicalization. Now, clearly, in the past year, we've seen some hopeful signs. We saw Wisconsin. We saw Occupy. And most importantly, and I'll talk about why it's important and somewhat different, we've seen the Chicago teachers strike. There are people who are willing to fight. However, we can see from particularly Wisconsin, but also Occupy, both the possibilities and limits of working class and popular fight back in the U.S. today. We were all inspired by what happened in Madison, Wisconsin over a year ago. The militancy of the struggles of public sector unions and of broad sections of the population of Wisconsin was inspiring to all of us. However, let's be clear, the official union leaders in Wisconsin were able to keep this entire movement within a framework that was acceptable to the Democrats in Wisconsin and nationally. On the one hand, the labor officials went into this fight accepting both cuts to public services and public worker concessions in the interest of balancing the budget. And on the other, the union leaders were able to undermine every attempt to turn this movement of protest into an actual militant struggle that included strikes. They undermined the sick out by the Madison public school teachers, which actually had the potential, as Kim Moody has pointed out in his article in the latest Against the Current on mass strikes, that had the potential to actually spark broader strikes in Madison, which could have, in fact, defeated Walker's agenda. While there were and are continuing attempts in Madison and in Wisconsin to organize rank-and-file unionists and community activists to oppose austerity and build more militant actions, their relatively small numbers made them during the height of the movement and now incapable of posing an effective alternative to the labor officials and the Democrats. We saw Occupy was, in some ways, much broader and more militant than the Wisconsin uprising, especially on the West Coast where unemployed people, some public sector unions, young people were able to shut down the port for a day. But even Occupy showed similar movements. Although it helped shift public discourse to the left for a period of time, making the issue of growing inequality, the 1% versus 99%, a central issue of discussion, the movement failed to make many concrete victories. And in early 2012, this year, many people who are radicalized by Occupy are under tremendous pressure to, just as folks were in Wisconsin, to get realistic, to put down their picket signs, pick up their clipboards, and campaign for Obama and the Democrats. The root of this crisis is basically the weakness of what we on the left used to call the militant minority. Historically, up until the 1940s and 50s in this country and around the world, you had a small layer of very conservative parliamentary politicians and union leaders who dominated the official labor movement. On the other hand, most members of unions and left-wing political parties were passive voters. They spent most of their time, not because they were indifferent, because living under capitalism sucks and it takes a lot of work. Most people, outside of big periods of struggle, were concerned with feeding their families, taking care of their lives, etc. And they left the struggle to the professionals, liberal or reformist politicians, trade union officials. But there was always, up through the 40s and 50s, a significant minority of workers, even in the United States, who tried to remain active in their workplaces and their communities, and who generally had radical politics, who were the ones who were always putting forward the idea that relying on the experts, the union officials, the politicians, etc., is not enough. We need to organize and fight. And at key moments when there would be upsurges and people would begin to move, these folks would be able to pose an effective alternative leadership to the union bureaucrats, the politicians, and were actually able to build important movements, win important victories, etc. This layer has grown progressively weaker since the Second World War. Almost a complete divorce between radicalism and organized labor as a result of McCarthyism. Even compared to the 60s and 70s, when new layers of young workers were beginning to radicalize, under the impact both of the the anti-racist and the anti-war social movements, and under the impact of inflation, speed up, etc., these layers of workers, many of them became demoralized, lost their jobs, etc. Not surprisingly, what we've seen in the past 30, 40 years is the experts, the politicians, the union bureaucrats can't deliver the goods anymore. On the other hand, there's no group of working people with real roots in their communities and their workplaces who can pose a credible alternative in most places. As a result, unions have declined, have made concessions, and more workers are pursuing individual solutions to their declining living standards, and which makes them open to the appeals of the right. Because if you're looking to take care of yourself and your family, and you don't believe you can get anything from the boss or from the state, then you're going to try to get over at the expense of other workers. Whites over people of color, native-born over immigrants, men over women, etc. Now, the Chicago teachers' strike was the one struggle where there was a difference. Because in fact, they didn't simply protest, they struck. They shut down the schools for 10 days. And most importantly, they won. They did not turn around the agenda of the Rahm Emanuel administration to close schools. They did not completely, they won what New York City teachers have had for a while. If you were a teacher in a closed school and you got laid off, they're going to keep you on payroll indefinitely, rather than fire you after a year. They were not able to eliminate the use of standardized student test scores for teacher evaluations. They pushed it, though, to the legal minimum. They won some improvement for some additional money to reduce class size, to increase the number of social workers, music and art teachers, etc. And they made significant wage gains. Now, why did this happen in Chicago and it's not happening elsewhere, and why it's not going to be easily replicated? Well, one of the key reasons that the Chicago teachers were able to do this is that over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, a significant militant minority of that 32,000 teachers, several hundred teachers, some of them members of organized left groups, others people who became pissed off and radical as a result of the continuous attacks on them as the cause of every problem from the common cold to poverty. Which is, 20 years ago, they blamed single mothers in the ghetto for all social problems. Now they're blaming public school teachers. These folks got together and not only got together around a fairly radical program, but they had drawn lessons from previous attempts to make the Chicago Teachers Union a fighting union, when they dissolved, where they elected some good people, but didn't maintain a network of rank-and-file activists in the school who could hold those people accountable. This time, they won. The caucus of rank and file educators 2 years ago, and immediately began to organize in their schools, to revive delegate structures, to revive membership mobilization, etc. Now, of course, the Emanuel administration gave them, their organizing, a shot in the arm last winter when they announced that a 4% raise that the teachers were supposed to get were going to be withdrawn. Large numbers of teachers who had voted for the core leadership, but believing that they'll take care of us, just the way the old ones were supposed to take care of us, suddenly got very pissed off and provided a much broader layer of people who are ready and willing to fight. So you had in Chicago a significant militant minority among teachers who was able to take advantage of this opening where broad layers of teachers became very angry about their promised raise being taken back, and were able to organize this and give it a much more radical political direction, where they said, yes, we are going to fight for wages and job security for teachers. And we should have nothing, as socialists and anti-capitalists, we should have no shame about fighting for working people to get more. But they also were very clear that we have to make the argument that our teaching conditions, our working conditions, are students' learning conditions, and use the anger that people had to, which allowed them to become open to appeals to, we need to reach out to parents, we need to reach out to students, because we need to make this a fight not only for our own wages, salaries, and job security, but for the future of public education. Now, their victory was a very partial one. In order for them to have gone any further on the use of standardized tests, on class size, would have required a confrontation, not simply with the Chicago public schools and Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, but a confrontation with the Illinois state government. That would have required other unions being willing to strike. Other teacher unions outside of Chicago in the big cities and maybe the suburbs, and other unions in Chicago, not just turning out their memberships for demonstrations, but through illegal sympathy strikes. At this point, the reason it didn't happen was because there aren't significant militant minorities among other groups of workers and in other teacher locals throughout the state of Illinois. Clearly, the victory in Chicago is going to give a shot in the arm to dissidents and militants in other teacher unions. It certainly is encouraging people in what's now called the movement of rank and file educators in New York, in the United Federation of Teachers, which represents K through 12 teachers. But the importance of Chicago, I don't think the Chicago teacher strike is going to turn things around, but it showed us if we were going to fight the right, we need to rebuild struggle. And rebuilding struggle requires a politics that at its very base says, we are at least independent of, if not hostile to, both political parties. And the leadership of CORE, and the leadership of the CTU was very clear about that. They knew that they were not just striking against Rahm Emanuel, they were striking against the Obama administration's education policy. And it was no accident that at the American Federation of Teachers convention this summer, when every other teacher local was giving huge ovations to Joe Biden and wearing blue Obama-Biden shirts, that the CTU contingent showed up in their red struggle t-shirts and turned their backs on Biden. So, to sum up, the rise of the right is the product of the radicalization of sectors of mostly white, mostly suburban, middle-class professionals, managers, small business people. They're filling a vacuum left by the crisis of liberalism and reformism, the crisis of the official leaders of the social movements, of the unions, etc., who have failed to pose an alternative to the rotting politics of the Democratic Party in this country. An alternative rooted in real struggles that could show people that there is a collective, class, radical, progressive response. It's our job as anti-capitalists, as socialists, as radicals, to be part of that process of rebuilding a militant minority. that understands the need for direct action, for social disruption, for strikes, and knows that we have no friends in either the Democratic or Republican parties, and that rebuilding those movements and lesser evil politics are incompatible. Thanks.
They have questions you want to ask now, or we can also just obviously chat with Charlie once we go from here to get beer. Anybody got any questions now?
Well, I just had a quick question. I guess being relevant to Murfreesboro here, several of us were involved with opposition to, in solidarity and support of the local Islamic community here when there was opposition against the creation of a mosque. And as somebody that was involved, I've paid attention and seen, a rise in xenophobia. And I can't, I guess I don't know for sure if it's just kind of coming to the surface now and there's just more public attention to it, or if it's just more like profitable to these opportunistic politicians and public figures. But I guess my question is, do you see like that those kind of far right groups, is that more driven by working class people radicalizing to these politics, or is it in the same line of the Tea Party where you have these like professional layer of?
Well, it's hard to tell, and I think you comrades probably have a better sense of that. My sense is that at a national level, the sort of attempts to organize and give direction to this Islamophobic, first of all, I think we need to be clear. While in Europe, Islamophobia is emerging as the dominant form of racism. It's become the dominant form of anti-immigrant racism in Europe. In the US, Islamophobia has a sort of much more limited place. It's not going to replace anti-black and Latino racism. Immigrants from Muslim countries don't make up anywhere near as the large numbers as people from East Asia and Latin America. And so, but I think that Islamophobia has been on the rise in this country since the beginning of the Gulf, since 9/11, since you saw some of it during the first Gulf War in the early 90s, but nothing like you've seen fairly consistently. Now, my sense is that at least in its leadership and a good part of its rank and file, it is these sort of professionals, managers, small business people. It's much the same personnel that drives the evangelical Christian right and has been driving the evangelical Christian right for quite a long time. Now, clearly, in many parts of the country, outside of the big cities, particularly the Midwest and South, but also you can see this in the Northeast, and the North is not exempt from this shit, that you are seeing sectors of white working class people, particularly those who have been drawn into these evangelical churches, involved in this stuff as well. But my sense is the people who are leading it and giving its greatest political direction are the same sorts that are giving the Tea Party its direction. But then again, like I said, you guys would have a better sense. I don't know the social composition of some of these, local Baptist churches that have been doing most of the mobilizing. I would imagine that in an area like this, there's a significant, that probably the main bulk of those congregations are professional small business people, managers, etc., but with a good portion of white working class people who work in unorganized industries, services, etc. But I can't say that for sure. Clearly, since the mid to late 70s, a significant minority of white workers have been voting Republican, these politics are appealing to them, and that's a reflection of the crisis of the labor movement. collective class solutions don't seem at all practical. So the idea of acting as collective workers doesn't make sense. You start acting, though, as competing sellers of your ability to work, which means that you're trying to get ahead at the expense of other workers. Thus, these sorts of xenophobic and racist appeals make sense to people.
Anybody else got any questions right now? You kind of stole my question, you jerk. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, Charlie. It was a fantastic
Thank you for
talk.
having me.